Mr. President, earlier this week, the Supreme Court of the United States issued an official code of conduct. This is really an update over existing rules that govern the ethics and operations of the judiciary, not only at the Supreme Court, but throughout the judiciary throughout the country. This document was important because questions have been raised about the practices of the court and about public disclosures of some of their activities. But the good news is this was adopted by all 9 members of the court and codifies ethics, rules, and principles that guide the justices' conduct. I'm glad that the court took this step to make clear to the American people that they were committed to operating with the highest ethical standards. But I get the impression that some of our colleagues here in the Congress think that it's the job of another branch of government to tell an independent branch of government what it ought to do. Obviously, it's basic government. We have 3 co-equal branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, those are the so-called political branches, and then there's the independent judiciary, which is, frankly, I believe, the crown jewel of our system. And I think there are those that sometimes feel like they don't like the decisions made by the federal judges, and that the best way to control that or to have an impact on it is to undermine public confidence in the judiciary. As my Republican colleagues and I have said for months, any decision about the Supreme Court's rules, including their recusal rules or a formal code of conduct, should not come from the Congress. It should come from the court itself, and now it has done so. The Senate has limited, albeit important, role when it comes to the Supreme Court, and that is through the confirmation process that we're all familiar with. As we know, all 9 members of the Supreme Court underwent a rigorous confirmation process. They endured hours and hours of questions from members of the Judiciary Committee. They had FBI background checks and other background checks. They met with each senator who was willing to meet with them one-on-one, and were ultimately confirmed to a seat on the highest court in the land. That is where the Senate's role ends. It is not Congress's responsibility or authority to force the justices to adopt a specific code of conduct or to dictate how the Supreme Court conducts its business. As I said, the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary is a separate and co-equal. Those are important words. Separate and co-equal branch of government. And it falls squarely outside of the legislature's authority to tell the Supreme Court how to run its business. There is another constitutional function that's available to us that fortunately we haven't had to use in a long time, which is impeachment. That's the role of the Senate and the House. The Senate confirms, but the House can vote articles of impeachment, and then there's a trial in the Senate in the most egregious set of circumstances, which thankfully we're not presented with. Many of our friends across the aisle have been particularly vocal about their desire to see a specific code of ethics for the Supreme Court. Matter of fact, our Democratic colleagues, the majority, have even co-sponsored a bill that would force a co-equal branch of government, the federal judiciary, to adopt a certain specific code of conduct. This was introduced by our colleague from Rhode Island, Senator Whitehouse, under the guise of ethics reform. In addition to the code of conduct, it would impose strict new rules for recusal. That means when judges should withdraw from and not participate in the decision of a case. It would also subject the justices to a never-ending stream of ethics complaints by politically motivated groups. The bill itself would incentivize frivolous ethics complaints against justices to prevent that specific justice from actually sitting on a particular case. The Wall Street Journal editorial board called this the Supreme Court Control Act, which is certainly an appropriate description. This bill was not designed to promote ethics and good governance. It was about forcing an independent branch of government to bend to the Senate's will. In July, Democrats on the Judiciary Committee banded together to pass this potentially unconstitutional bill, but the majority leader has yet to bring it to the floor for a vote because I think he understands it would be dead on arrival. Now that the Supreme Court has adopted an official code of conduct, I hope our colleagues across the aisle will finally lay this bad idea to rest. They said they wanted the Supreme Court to adopt a code of conduct. The justices have now done that, and so now this should be a moot issue. I hope this development will also encourage the chairman of the Judiciary Committee to abandon his latest partisan attack on the court. In the Judiciary Committee last Thursday, the Chairman Durbin and Senator Whitehouse planned to expand their so-called ethics investigation by issuing subpoenas to private individuals. To be clear, the targets of these subpoenas are not government officials, they're not judges, they're not elected officials, they are private citizens. Democrats want to bully, interrogate, potentially embarrass these individuals for committing what in their eyes amounts to a serious crime, which is being friends with a Supreme Court justice. Senators Durbin and Whitehouse claim this is about transparency and rebuilding trust, but the evidence suggests the opposite. I find it telling that the only subpoenaed targets are known to donate to Republican candidates and conservative causes. Democrats seem to have zero interest in hearing from liberal billionaires and dark money groups who have made it their mission to rig the Supreme Court in Democrats' favor. If our colleagues wanted to hear from folks who actually jeopardize the legitimacy of the court, my Republican colleagues and I plan to provide a range of options. We planned to provide a range of options at last week's meeting. But then abruptly, Senator Durbin gavelled us out without taking up these subpoenas. But I did file an amendment to subpoena liberal billionaire George Soros, for example, who's one of the biggest benefactors of the Democratic Party and a major contributor to the dark money group known as Demand Justice. This isn't your typical public interest advocacy group. The entire goal of the misnamed Demand Justice is to pack the court and install a permanent liberal majority. Last year, one of the co-founders of Demand Justice tweeted, "It's time for the Democrats to see the court as a political opponent, just as much as any Republican elected official, and run against it." So Demand Justice, funded by George Soros, was saying, we need to target these lifetime tenured non-political office holders as political opponents and run against them. If we want to talk about depoliticizing the court and rebuilding faith in the judiciary, this is where the Judiciary Committee should look. The millionaires and billionaires who are bankrolling the effort to brand the court as a political opponent are far more relevant to this debate than longtime personal friends of the justices. I was eager to see if Democrats' commitment to transparency held up when wealthy Democrats were on the receiving end of a subpoena, but we never found out. As I said, just before the committee was supposed to vote, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee abruptly adjourned the meeting. I'd like to think because he finally had second thoughts about how dangerous and inappropriate this entire effort was. After all, the Senate Judiciary Committee has no business issuing subpoenas for private citizens under the guise of transparency. There was no legitimate legislative purpose for conducting this witch hunt. Maybe our Democratic colleagues realized that Republican amendments were likely to pass too, causing their partisan smear campaign to backfire. But the chairman claimed that it was just a matter of timing, and he's put the subpoena authorizations on the docket for the Judiciary Committee meeting tomorrow morning, Thursday, this week. Democrats claim that the justices are to blame for distrust and lack of confidence in the court. But let's take a look at some facts. The justices already file, like we do, annual financial disclosure reports. They recuse themselves under their rules from cases when it's inappropriate for them to sit. They go to great lengths to avoid the appearance of impropriety. To assuage any remaining concerns about ethical standards, as I said, the justices just adopted a code for the first time in history. Meanwhile, Senate Democrats who claim to care about public trust and confidence in the court are on the warpath. The Democratic leader, the majority leader of the United States Senate, stood on the steps of the Supreme Court just months ago and threatened two sitting justices by name, saying they would pay the price and they didn't know what would hit them if they didn't reach his preferred decision in an abortion case. Unbelievable. A group of 5 Democratic senators made a not-so-subtle threat to the court, claiming it could be restructured if it didn't deliver the preferred outcome in a case involving the Second Amendment. 15 Democratic senators, including several members of the Judiciary Committee, recommending slashing the Supreme Court's budget if it failed to meet their demand to implement a new code of ethics that had the Democrats' stamp of approval on it. And now the chairman of the Judiciary Committee wants to interrogate private citizens over their personal finances, something he claims is imperative to restoring trust in the Supreme Court. Well, it's pretty clear that the so-called ethics crisis in the Supreme Court isn't really about ethics at all. It's about exerting control and domination over a separate co-equal branch of government, as the Constitution itself provides. So it's time for the Judiciary Committee to abandon its partisan charade and focus on the actual crises facing our country. While the chairman spends valuable time, limited time, dealing with this made-up controversy, we see nearly 2.5 million border crossings in the past year. We're losing 70,000 Americans a year to fentanyl poisoning. The Biden administration has also lost track of hundreds of thousands of migrant children. You would think that would be a matter of some urgency to the Judiciary Committee and its chairman that has jurisdiction over those matters. But these aren't problems that have earned the time and attention of the Judiciary Committee. Rather, it's chosen partisan attacks on the independence of the Supreme Court. I urge my colleagues to abandon their partisan attacks on the Supreme Court and to get back doing the work of the American people. And a good place to start would be at the southern border. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.